Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of our Endgame series. Now, it's been approximately a year since the last video in this series came out. And at the start of this very ambitious project, which is to assemble a comprehensive database of videos on essentially all types of common endgames that will hopefully take the place of tedious books or boring courses and will allow you, no matter your level, to acquire the skills necessary to succeed in most types of endgames. So when I started this project, I was full of inspiration, and I made the promise that I will not abandon it. As hard as it is, as ambitious as it is, I promise that I will keep it going until I make this database, until I make this dream into a reality. And unfortunately, over the last couple of months, as I've talked about on my stream, I've been quite a bit burnt out. I've had a lot going on, and I've sort of prioritized my mental health and my physical health. And I felt the inspiration kind of coming back bit by bit. And most important to me is that I don't sacrifice qualities, that I don't just like put out a video to say that I put out a video. And this morning, I just felt ready. I felt that I was ready to resume this series, ready to resume looking for material, and ready to resume helping you in your journey to become, hopefully one day, an endgame master. So if you're newer to the channel, I want to quickly bring everybody up to speed on where we are and what we're doing here, and then I promise that we will jump in quickly. Don't start solving. I know there's a position on the screen, but you don't even know whose move it is. So just pay attention for another minute or so to make sure that we're all on the same page. So far in the Endgame series, we have covered pawn endgames in their entirety. And we started the second type of endgame in logical succession, which I believe to be a wildly understudied and underappreciated type of endgame, yet one that is chock full of incredible nuances and beauty, but more importantly is surprisingly common. It commonly arises in tournament play across all levels, and that, of course, is knight versus pawns. Endgames where one side has a king and any number of pawns, 1 to 15, no, just kidding, 1 to 8, but generally an assortment of pawns, and the other side has a king, a knight, and also either 0 pawns, 1 pawn, any amount of pawns. So we are dealing with a fight between an army of pawns, or maybe an army of just 1 pawn, against a knight and also a potential army of pawns. These endgames are very, very tactical. They're inherently tactical because you have a piece imbalance, and very often you have incredible races. You have this epic battle between the knight, which is considered to be a very awkward piece when it comes to dealing with passed pawns, and oftentimes in the endgame in general, but that can nonetheless prove its worth in pretty incredible ways. Now, in the first video addressing knight versus pawn endgames, we did a conceptual overview. I introduced the most important concepts and theoretical positions to you. I will link this video in the description. If you have not seen it, I highly recommend you to do so, because these endgame videos, they build off of each other. And even the concepts that you see on the right, and I'll get to that momentarily, all of them were addressed in that introductory video. So if you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor, watch that video carefully, and make sure that you have the definitions and the concepts down pat. Now, in this video, as well as in the next one, we will do the same thing that we did in the pawn endgame segment, which is that I will offer you an opportunity to test your knowledge of these concepts and to make your understanding of them more robust by examining an assortment of much more complicated positions in which the concepts intermingle and in which they're quite a bit harder to apply than in the relatively simple positions that I was giving in the first video on this endgame topic. So if you've watched the pawn endgame series, you kind of know what this looks like. I will give you a series of exercises. You can treat this as a test and pause the video at the beginning of each exercise when I prompt you to solve it as thoroughly as you can. Or you can treat this as just any other video. You're under no obligation to solve. You can just watch. And I think both methods have their pros and cons. You can decide what works for you. But the goal of these next 2 videos is to make your understanding of these concepts more robust, because it's one thing to understand definitions. in an ideal world, and quite another when you add a layer of chaos and you add layers and layers of nuance. So it's not the case that each example will be very cleanly tied to like one concept. That'll happen, but it'll be rare. What you'll see is that these concepts intermingle, and I will try whenever I can to really tie every move, every instructive moment to the appropriate concept to really show you how your conceptual understanding combined with, of course, accurate calculation can lead to success even in very complicated positions. I have quite a few positions to get through, so this might be a long video. Buckle your seatbelts, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. I know this was kind of a 6-minute introduction, but I wanted to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page. Let's jump in. So the way that I have divided this video, as well as the next one, is that in this video, we will essentially take the side of the pawns. We will play for the side that does not have the knight, that has the pawns. And this is further subdivided into two types of exercises. In the first segment of exercises, you will be trying to win the game. The pawns will be ultimately trying to defeat the knight on the side of the knight, whereas in the second set of exercises, you will be trying to make a draw. So I'm making it a little bit easier for you by telling you what the goal is, but that's as you'll see, that's not going to make it too much easier. Now, I've formatted the screen a little bit differently. Hopefully, it's you like it. On the right, you can see essentially all of the key concepts that are going to be occurring again and again throughout these examples. And as I mention these concepts, I think, to me, I like having something on the screen just so I can kind of refer to it and make sure that it's clearly ingrained in my memory. Now, these are not all of the concepts that I will mention. If something ends up occurring frequently, then I might just add it to this list. Okay, so having laid the groundwork, let's jump in. And we're going to start with a lovely position that is essentially forcing. I wouldn't call this easy, but it's, I think, a very satisfying way to start. It's not too deep of calculation. And if you understand the concept, then it'll be much, much easier than if you're kind of looking at it from scratch. So this is a game between Jairam Ashwin, a grandmaster who actually lives in Charlotte, my city. I know Jairam very well. He's playing against a strong Turkish player. It's black to play. And black is fighting for a draw here. Black has the rook and the knight and the pawn, but white clearly has a very active queen, and the queen has a lot of potential to deliver some nasty checks. So black can draw this game several different ways, but he has to be careful. Knight d4 check and knight h4 check would be the two moves that lead to the cleanest draw. But Karagan plays the move knight to g7. He drops the knight back. He goes after the h5 pawn. And it turns out that this move loses to a spectacular sequence. And you might be looking at this and saying, wait a second, knight against pawns. There's a queen on the board. There's a rook on the board. Remember that part of the fun is to transition into the knight versus pawn endgames. That's also where some of the beauty is derived. So sometimes I won't give you the type of endgame at the start. You have to get to it. Sometimes that's where the difficulty lies. Okay, white to play. Feel free to pause the video. I'll give you a little bit of silent thinking time before we start discussing the solution. Okay, so knight g7 does a good job of covering the e6 square. And to me, the most tempting move is to deliver a check on d8. But this is what black was hoping for. Black centralizes the king on e5, and black will probably win the pawn on d5. White is a little bit better here. There are winning chances with queen h8, but the game goes on, and there's nothing convincing. Now, one thing that you might notice just looking at this position very carefully is that there's this kind of cool tactical idea of taking on g5 and pushing h6. And this leads us directly to the Sheron theme, which is the second bullet point on the right. The Sheron theme is named after André Sheron, who was a French study composer and endgame expert. And he kind of first drew attention to this pattern where, for instance, black plays king f6. This actually loses the game because after h7, the knight on g7 blocks the king's ability to stop the pawn. And the knight itself also cannot stop the pawn. Unfortunately, in this particular manifestation, this doesn't work because black has this sequence. Knight f5, h7, and unfortunately, the knight stops the pawn with checks, which was also a theme, by the way, in our introductory video. Knight h4 check, the knight circles back to g6. then parks on h8 and black wins the game. But this gives us an important hint. This idea of sacking the queen for the rook, maybe we can find a different manifestation of it and a better execution. And indeed, a better execution exists. Kudos if you spotted queen f8 check, forcing the king to e5. Now we grab the pawn with check, forcing the king further away from the king side. And now it's time to execute the Sheron theme. Queen takes rook check, and it's an incredible position. White has only one pawn, and it defeats the entire army. But there's more subtleties here to address. If black plays king e6, by now you should understand that the whole point of the Sheron theme is that you don't take this knight, you use this knight as an obstacle. Funny little detail, if you really want to troll your opponent, you can actually waste a tempo. This is how bad knights are at stuffing past pawns. And here you get the actual full Sheron theme. This is exactly the position that he first gave as an illustration. But don't try that at home. Not recommended. But Kerrigan says, wait a second, I can do the same exact thing that we discussed in the previous line, and he plays knight f5. And kudos, major kudos, if you saw this as well and calculated until the end of the line. White pushes h7. And the point is that by distracting the black king, you are rendering this maneuver ineffective. And this directly ties into our discussion of the power of a corner pawn on the 7th rank. Out of all the pawns that could be on the 7th rank, when you're fighting against a knight, the corner pawn is the most powerful because it restricts the knight most fully. And after knight to h8, king to f6, we're just going to go to g7. And notice that we're also preventing black's king from tailing us over to f7. Amazing. Black is in Zugzwang. If it were white to move here, it would actually be a draw. Mind-boggling concept, but black has to move the king. And obviously, black is not in time in the pawn race. Okay, maybe not so obvious. It's one tempo. d3, h8, d2. We stop the pawn comfortably, park our queen on d1, and win the game. So knight h4 check, king g4, and king takes g5. Black can try the tricky knight e5, but here it is simply deflected by king f6 and king to g7. And we will come across this particular arrangement where there are two squares between the king and the knight once again, but we will address that in a subsequent example. In the game, Kerrigan played g4 check. Now, king takes g4 is actually winning, but Ashwin played king f4, which is also totally acceptable. The knight moves up to h4. Again, this is one of the main ways that the knight tries to indirectly prevent promotion, is by trying to set up a fork. But here, clearly, king takes g4. King to g5 was also winning, but Ashwin grabs the pawn and transitions directly into the line that we examined previously. Knight e5 was played in the game. And, okay, Ashwin could have won with king g7. He played king f5. And after king f4, black resigned the game because white is promoting, and the technical win is very easy. So here you see the Sheron theme in the wild. You might think that this kind of thing never occurs, but it does. It does, and you should keep an eye out for it, particularly if there's a knight on g7. This might be the worst square on the board when it comes to stopping past pawns. All right, on we go to the next example. Okay, let's flip the board. Some of these are for black, some of these are for white. I'll be flipping the board as necessary. Okay, so this is a very ostensibly simple position that occurred between an IM, Gerhard Schroll, and a very strong Hungarian GM, Ferenc Berkes. And one of the things that makes these knight versus pawn endgames so devilish is that they are often deceptively simple. It often looks very simple to calculate the lines, like what could there possibly be? And it's very easy to make false assumptions in these types of endgames because, well, what are you used to in pawn endgames? You're used to pushing pawns, right? You're used to making the natural move. And often in these endgames, the natural move is wrong for a variety of reasons. And in this example, white got burned precisely because he made a move on autopilot mode. So in this position, it is white to move, and it's a dead draw. White should draw. White can draw in a variety of ways. The simplest way for white to draw is just to basically chill in the center. King d3. Black doesn't make king f5. And king e2, king e4. You set up what I call the force field. You set up the force field with knight c2. This is a pretty important pattern to be aware of. Black simply cannot pass. Look at how the knight is essentially building a wall single-handedly and stopping the pawn. So, don't crap on knights too much. Black cannot make progress. King f4, we're just chilling with knight a1 and knight c2. Nothing that black can do. So that's just one of several ways that The white can draw if black plays king d5 and knight b3 is good enough. f3, knight a1, just wait around. f2, king e2, king c4. This is the trickier line. And here you use the imprisoned king technique. We talked about this situation at the end of the introductory video. You might think it's losing, but no, here white is able to tail the king successfully into the corner and then entrap it with a stalemate. Okay, so let's go through that line again. King to d5. We're waiting with knight b3. The important thing here is not to play king e3 because you're giving away a tempo here. You're allowing king c4 with tempo that hits the knight, and white is a tempo too late here, right? So compared to the main line, white is a tempo too late. So often in these endgames, you want to wait for the pawn to come to you. The knight drops back to a1. This gains us a tempo. If black waits, then we can already go king e3. Yeah, f2, king e2, and the rest is just a matter of getting the tempi straight. So this would have drawn a couple of other ways to draw, but Sheron wants to force things. He doesn't want uncertainty. He wants to end this game and go home, and so he plays the move king to b2, confident that this is one of the several drawing lines. Can you point out the flaw in his reasoning? How does black win this position? Sorry about that. Okay. So, what is going on here? Well, clearly the only way that we are going to conceivably win this position is by promoting the f-pawn. And in order to promote the f-pawn, well, we need to push it. We need to play f3 and f2. And we also need to restrict white's knight. So in order to solve this efficiently, what concepts come to the fore? What do you have to know? First concept is that you have to be aware of the behavior of a pawn on the f-file or the bishop's file when it is restricted by the knight. You have to be aware that most of those positions, in the absence of any other pawns, are drawn. And if you know this, then you can automatically, well, not on a bad word, but you can essentially rule out f3 without much calculation. f3 is incredibly tempting, but it is wrong. And it's wrong because white plays knight b3. This is definitely what Sheron was hoping for, f2. White stops the pawn with knight d2. And as discussed in the introductory video, this position is a theoretical draw, and it's a comfortable draw. Black can't even technically repeat moves. The king d3, black chases the knight around. White can go knight g3. White can even go knight h2, kind of a luxurious move. Black has no choice but to promote the queen and promote to a queen and make a draw. So f3 doesn't win the game. And you might say, well, if we're not pushing f3, what else is there to do? But here the concept of the king dominating over the knight really is so nicely evident. I think this is so instructive. The correct move is to advance the king to e4. And white actually resigned in this position. He immediately realized what he had done. But let's understand why king e4 is such a devastating move. The point is actually very, very simple. White's knight has only one square from which it can stop the f1, and that is d2. If you can cut away the d2 square, if you can take it away, you win the game because the king will dominate the knight. So the goal is to just get the king to e3. After king e4, let's say that white plays king takes a2. Now, you don't want to start with king e3 because that walks into a check. Now it's a good idea to push f3. White has to try knight b3. And after king e3, we get the situation that I kind of alluded to in the previous example, where the best placement traditionally for the king when it comes to restricting the knight is either diagonally or horizontally, or vertically, such that there are two squares between them. Okay, this is a very robust rule of thumb. And the reason for that is also simple. The king is preventing knight d2, it's preventing knight d4, it's preventing the knight from essentially crossing the Rubicon, and black promotes the pawn unimpeded. So white can try to play knight to b3 immediately. Once again, we play king e3, and this is exactly the same thing. Another instantiation of the same principle would happen after f3 knight c4 check. Where do you go with the king? Again, you go king e2. Okay, here there's actually one square, so let me amend that a little bit. When you are restricting the knight horizontally, you want there to be two squares between the king and the knight. I apologize. When you are restricting the knight diagonally, you want there to be one square between the king and the knight. Because if there were two squares, then white would be able to play knight d4 check and take the pawn. Okay, so you can see that very clearly here, just visually, but make sure that you have that kind of straight in your mind. So after king e2, promotion is inevitable. There is not much else that white can try. If white plays knight to c2, then we simply play f3, and the knight is not catching the pawn. King takes a2, f2, and black wins the game. So after king e4, white immediately resigned. What a tragic loss. Last thing I'll point out, if the king tries to make a run for it and stop the f-pawn, here we go king d3, fully restricting both the king and the knight. King to d1, we push f3. And once again, king e1 is forced, otherwise f2, king to c3, king b2. And again, the power of that corner pawn on a2 on full display. Black wins the game. Okay, on we go to the next example. I remind you that we are still taking the side of the pawns in this video, and right now we are trying to win in every position. Now, this game ultimately ended in a draw, but that doesn't matter. It's because white made a very instructive mistake. Okay, this is not a famous game at all. None of the games in this video are well known, and that's by design. This is a game between two relatively weaker players in 2000, 2100, decent club players. But this is what I love about chess. Anybody can produce an incredibly instructive game. You don't always have to show Tal's games or Kasparov's games. This is really what I like to do. Okay, so make sure that you're acquainting yourself with what's going on here. There's a lot that's going on. It's white to play, and you might not even intuitively understand. You might not even intuitively believe that white is playing for a win, and black is up a knight. The pawn on a7 is restricted. Black has a pass pawn of their own. But in fact, white is winning by force with an incredible line. Really, really beautiful details here. And your job is to figure this line out. Okay, take a little bit of time. I'm going to go grab a food delivery. I will be back in about 30, 45 seconds. Maybe Clyde will take this out of the video, but I actually want to keep this in. I mean, even GM's got to order food sometimes, right? All right, take some time. I would recommend that everybody tries to solve this just to go through the experience. Even if you're watching this video just kind of as an instructional video, I would really recommend that you take a stab at this puzzle in particular. You won't regret it. And I will be right back. All right, folks, I'm back. So white is winning this game. But before we go into the weeds, before we start calculating, it's very important to create kind of a roadmap, particularly with an eye toward understanding what the target positions are. What are we aiming for here with white? Because it can be very overwhelming when you have a chaotic position, particularly an endgame where there's nothing to grasp onto. And so you start calculating aimlessly, and that's exactly how blunders happen. So let's make a series of basic observations that will kind of lead us in the direction of the solution. The first thing we should notice is that white has two passed pawns. The pawn on a7 is obviously the star of the show. And so immediately we can conclude that probably one target position will involve somehow distracting the black king and then snaking our way into c5. In general, this c5 square is prime real estate. If we can get our king to c5, not only do we force the knight back into the corner, but potentially we could also capture the pawn before resuming our journey to c6. And so on the basis of this alone, the most natural move, the move that you should start by calculating, is g6. So let's put g6 on the board because it is also the correct move. Sometimes the correct move is the most natural move, right? I think that chess books and chess instructional literature sometimes I think has this slightly annoying habit of suggesting that the natural move is never the correct move. Sometimes it is. This is the real world. By the way, this game was played in 1951. I forgot to mention that. So black's response to this move is absolutely forced. Black must play king e6. There's no other way to stop the pawn. Now we proceed with our plan and play king to d4. And if black plays the cooperative king f6 and everything is copacetic, we have reached our target position. We're chilling. The knight has to go back. We take. We have all the time in the world. Black is once again one tempo short. Not all the time in the world. Usually everything is tempo for tempo. But black is not going to cooperate. And major kudos to you, pat on the back, if you were able to spot the most resilient defensive resource, which is b4. Black is a passed pawn. He's going to try to use it to deflect the white king and perhaps to buy some time that black can use to inch the king back to the queen side. Now in this position, there's not much that white can do. other than king to c5, you have to play it. And now the fun calculation begins. Now, after king to c5, if black plays knight a8, again, seemingly the cooperative move, king takes b4, it's the same thing, king f6, king to c5, king g6, king c6, transposing into the line that we just examined. Now, I should mention, by the way, that g7 draws the game. It gives away the win. Why does g7 give away the win? Because it basically gifts black a tempo, right? The tempo that black was spending playing king f6, you have wasted it here, and now if you go down the same line after knight a8, it's a draw. Here, black is in time to do the imprisonment of the white king, which is a theme that by now should be extremely familiar to you. I mean, you should kind of automatically never assume that just because you trap the knight in the corner, the game is over. This is stalemate. Black draws the game. Okay, so we keep the pawn on g6 and we play the move king to c5. But once again, black will not cooperate, and black has b3. And suddenly it appears that white is out of luck because, well, it seems like you have to take the knight. And it may be exciting that white promotes first, but you should remember from the pawn race video that it's not the side that promotes first. It's often the side that promotes with check, which has the real advantage. Well, of course, black does not have an advantage here, but black makes a draw very easily because he's promoted with check. For instance, king c7. The easiest here is king f6. The pawn is surrounded. The white king is too exposed. There are no winning chances. This is a draw. What are we missing? Is g6 the wrong move? Well, we're missing something, but g6 is the right move. And I have led you to the proper spot. If you've seen this idea already from the start, major pats on the back. If you haven't, pause the video here and see if you can figure out the incredible improvement that enables white to win the game smoothly. So, I said at the start that the a-pawn is likely to be the star of the show. No, the star of the show in this example is the g-pawn. Now we play g7, threatening g8 queen. Now I hear you saying, but we've been through this. How does this help? Well, here the idea is very specific and very tactical. You promote to a queen, forcing the king into the checking zone of the queen. And this is what I mean when I say that endgame knowledge builds on top of each other. We talked about this exact concept in the pawn race video, where you use one of your pawns as a decoy, forcing the enemy king onto an undesirable square. Or you can use your king to do that. In any case, you force the king onto an undesirable square. In this case, it is in the checking zone of the pawn that will promote. White promotes with check. We stop the pawn, and the champagne drinking and debauchery can begin. Of course, you can also play king takes b6 and then promote. Doesn't matter. This move order doesn't actually matter. But notice the subtlety. If you play g7 here, this is too early because here black still has the move knight a8. Whereas after king c5, b3, obviously you're going to be capturing the knight. So you're not allowing black to play knight a8 in the right version. This is the winning line for white. Let's go through it again very quickly. g6, forcing the king back, king to d4, inching toward our target position. But black does not cooperate. And here you apply, after king c5, b3, a concept from pawn endgames, forcing the enemy king, not this move, but g7, forcing the enemy king onto the checking zone of the pawn, and then winning the game with a check. Okay, so before I move on, I want to show very quickly how white squandered the win, because it's also very instructive. Instead of g6, Kindi, which I hope I'm pronouncing this halfway correctly, this game was played in Sarajevo, in the country that was then known as Yugoslavia. Now Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia. So white plays a very ingenious move. He drops the king back to c2. And don't laugh at this move. I know that it looks absurd. It seems totally counterproductive, but actually he's got a pretty brilliant idea. What on earth could be the concept behind king to c2? What is going on here? So here's the thing. In order to understand this move, let's consider for a second the move king to c3, which I think is slightly more natural than king to c2. The problem with king to c3 is that when black drops the king back to c6, if we push g6, black is able to stop both pawns by delegating the a-pawn to the king and the g-pawn to the knight. Once again, the knight is able to stop the pawn with a check. Another very important concept, king d4, knight e7, and white has nothing better than to perpetually chase the knight. Remember that with a g-pawn, it's worse than an h-pawn, but better than an f-pawn. For the side of the pawn, you can chase the knight forever f7, g6, f7, etc. So white's idea was to get out of the line of fire of the knight. He was hoping for king c6, and now after g6, king b7, g7, the knight is unable to stop the pawn. It's unable to deliver the check. So quite a deep idea that white came up with. What he forgot about is that black is under no obligation to start with king to c6. And as a matter of fact, there is a way for black to arrange the knight and king to do the same thing, but without allowing promotion. The correct move here is knight to a8. Black found it. And the point is this. If white pushes g6, then of course here, king e6 and black is in time. So in the game, white advances the king to b3. Now the knight maneuvers to c7. Okay, so once again, g6, there's king e6, and black is fine. White plays king b4. Black plays king to c6. Suddenly, it's a little switcheroo. White pushes g6, knight d5 check, and we have achieved, black has achieved the ideal setup. The king has to move. Black's king drops back. Black takes the pawn. I mean, g7, knight e7 would have been the same thing. And black comfortably stops the pawn with a draw ensuing in just a couple of moves. It was a very creative idea, but unfortunately, knights are more resilient than that. This knight a8, knight c7 maneuver, something to consider, something to note. We're not going to flesh it out at length because here we're dealing primarily with the side that has the pawns. But in the next video, we're going to talk a lot about these situations where, yes, the knight is tied down to a pawn, but it still has a certain degree of flexibility because it can be stopping the pawn from various squares, and those squares themselves can also be jumping off points. So it gets pretty complicated, but long story short, the correct move is g6. What concepts are at play? In this example, well, obviously we have the corner pawn on the 7th. We have the imprisoned king draw that we need to avoid. And we have, of course, applying pawn endgame themes as well. On we go to the next position. And I'm already seeing that we probably will not have time to address all of the exercises that I have prepared. So we'll see how it goes. This is a position that I really, really like. It's a very instructive position. It's elegant, it's clean, and I think it'll teach you quite a bit about just how powerful pawns can be in conjunction with a king. So this game occurred in an open tournament in Spain between 2300 with white and a very strong international master with black. So that we're not talking about some, potzers off the street here. In this position, it's black to play. And black can draw the game, but he needs to be careful. There are many ways to draw the game, but black needs to be vigilant. The easiest way to draw the game would have been to push g5, freezing white's pawns. The point is that if white plays king to d7, and there's not much better that white can do. If e7, then black's king snakes around to f7. If king d7, knight f6 check, black has time to take the pawn and then return to f6, and we're going to liquidate into an obviously drawn pawn endgame. There are several other moves to draw as well, but Tejedor, this is what happens. You kind of just relax. You think everything, how could this possibly be lost? Everything draws. He plays king g8. It's the losing move. Why does king g8 lose? Try to figure it out. Now, I think if you approach this position correctly, the first move should be rather obvious to you. My challenge to you is that you try to calculate until the very end of the line because it's move for move, right? There's no alternatives available. White has to be ultra precise until the end. Man, eating while recording a YouTube video. How unprofessional. Okay. So. Man, I feel like I'm about to free solo El Capitan. Let's present the solution. The correct move is, in fact, g5. Restricting, right? Positional themes, they don't go anywhere in the endgame, right? Middle game themes are very much applicable, often even more so, because there's only one piece left. So the idea of restricting a minor piece with your pawns is on full display here. You push g5, and suddenly the knight is out of squares. But that isn't necessarily itself a problem, because black can move the king. Black has a pawn move. And so Tejedor plays king to f8. If he had gone g6, we would have reached the same position after king d7, king f8. You'll see. So he plays king f8. The next step for us is to inch our king closer to black's knight. This forces black to play the only available move. I was going to say the only legal move. It's essentially the only legal move. There actually is another tricky option that I will get to at the very end, but this is extremely advanced. It appears that black's only move is g6. Okay. Now, what's the next step? The next step is to advance the pawn as far as it can go to e7, and after king f7, we get an ultra-critical position. if you were able to visualize the line up to this position, but were kind of confused, that's okay. This is a very tricky situation. So this is a situation in which the kings are essentially jockeying for the remains of the knight. It's like a bunch of siblings who fight over their relative's estate, right? And they hire lawyers. Which king is going to win? Which king is going to claim the ultimate prize of the E8 knight? Well, that depends on which king maneuvers more skillfully and involves its faithful servants, the pawns, in the proper way. So first thing to mention is that Black's knight has now acquired a waiting square on g7. So simply waiting is not going to do anything. Black has too many possibilities to just wait. Clearly, you have to use this tiny little pawn on h2, which so far has remained, completely dormant. And looking at this and applying a concept from pawn endgames, here we go with this again, you might notice that we have the situation, we have this 2-on-1, and we can try to use a pawn breakthrough. Assume for a second that white's h-pawn reaches h5. If black plays g takes h5, we can push g6, knocking the black king out of its support of the knight, and clearly we're going to win the pawn race. Our pawn is on the 7th rank. But this is where the pitfall lies. If you excitedly play h4, you give up the win. Because after knight to g7, well, the knight's no longer on e8, so h5 actually loses the game. You can do all of this, and then there's going to be nothing to capture on e8. Black is just going to take the newly promoted queen and make a queen themselves. And white has nothing better to do than to wait with king d8. Black gives a check on e6, and we repeat the position after knight to g7. So the key to the kingdom, this is why I love this position. This move is why I love this position. h3, only winning move. h3. What is the idea? You need to get this position with white to move again. So after h3, black has to go knight g7. Now we push h4. Black has to return to e8. There's no other moves. It's quite important that this pawn endgame, well, this is dead lost, because you're just going to shoulder your way into winning the g6 pawn. Black has to go knight e8. Now we push h5, and this works like a charm. If g takes h5, breakthrough, king takes e8, step aside, promote the queen with plenty of time to spare. Black tries the tricky move knight to g7. Here, one last, pitfall to avoid. I mean, obviously, h takes g6 is ridiculous. We push h6, and the h-pawn is going to do the honors. Knight e8, h7. And black resigned after a meaningless spite check on f6. And white found all of these moves in an over-the-board game. Kudos to Orontes Taboada. Okay, so there was one tiny little detail that I noticed just before going live. I was doing a quick review of the positions, and I was like, wait a second. In this position, can black try this incredibly devilish move, knight to c7? Right, and we will address at length the concept of sacking the knight. When you have the knight, you can often sack it in order to transition into a favorable pawn endgame. This will be addressed in the next video, of course. But this is a great way to kind of break the ice, because after king takes c7, king e7, black is able to make the draw. This is a complicated pawn endgame, but you can take my word for it. You can analyze it yourself. Black can hold the draw here. So amazingly, after knight e7, we actually have to ignore the hanging knight and proceed with our plan. e7 check, king f7, and now we have a variety of ways to win. Here we can actually play h4. Same plan. We're just going to go h5, and after g6, h5, g takes h5, g6. Although the knight is not on e8, it is on c7. It is hanging. Black has to try to cling to the pawn, and g7 wins the game. Another beautiful line, by the way, where you can really see the power of the pawns. Tear black apart, take c7, back to d7, and promote to a queen. So perhaps this would have been a more resilient defense, but I have no doubt that white wouldn't have fallen for it and would have played e7. So don't automatically capture the knight if it is offered to you. So what are the takeaway themes with this example? Again, we have the concept of the passive knight. We have restriction, which can play a very important role in setting yourself up for success. Again, we can see the application of a super important theme from pawn endgames, which is the pawn breakthrough, and also the importance of not rushing and calculating very clearly. Just like in pawn endgames, whose turn it is, whose move it is, can be incredibly important. And if you're kind of attuned to that, then you realize that oftentimes you don't want to exhaust all of your waiting moves at once. The point is to synchronize it to the proper position, to get the proper position with the proper side to move. Okay. Now, I'm looking at the video here. I'm seeing that we're right at 40 minutes or so. And the final position in which we are playing for a win with the side that has the pawns is one of the most instructive positions that I've ever come across. It's absolutely epic. Okay, it's not the starting position is also quite epic, but it's this position. Even computers struggle to properly evaluate this position. So I'm going to make the executive decision to put this aside. Maybe we'll do this in the next video. I will definitely present this position to you, but I don't want to overwhelm you with exercises because then, just because the video becomes very hard to watch. I want to give this position the justice that it deserves and the explanation that it deserves. So let's put this one aside and let's transition to part 2 of our practicum, which is going to be drawing the game. In part 1, we used the pawns to win the game. In part 2, we are trying to make a draw against the side that has a knight. And we're going to start with a lovely position that's fairly simple. Again, if and only if you very diligently mastered the definitions and the concepts in the introductory video. Let me change the text box here. Now we're going to be drawing the pawns. Now this position occurred in a game between two very strong players, IMs. Black is clearly playing for a win. Black has 2 extra pawns. And in this position, Piskov played the move king to e6, which is by far the most natural move. He's setting up knight f5 check. He's probably already thinking about what he's going to have for dinner that evening. Well, he probably did have dinner that evening, but his mood was a much more somber one than he expected. How did White make that happen? White to play and draw the game miraculously. Okay, so this is a direct application. This is a direct application of the opposition draw. This is a direct application of the opposition draw, in which even though one side can be down an entire knight, it doesn't matter because the other side, usually the other side only has 1 pawn, simply cannot make progress because the lone king is able to dominate the entire army, the knight, the king, as well as the pawn. Just a moment. Okay. Now, how do we do that? A quick look at the position will reveal that there are 2 ways for White to sacrifice the knight. There's knight takes e4 and knight takes d5. Which of those moves is correct? Well, the correct move is the one that immediately allows you to achieve a direct textbook version of the opposition draw. It's knight takes d5. This is the drawing move. Okay, if you look at knight takes e4 carefully, you'll realize that it makes no sense. Because here you might say, oh, I have the opposition. But remember, it's not just the opposition that you have to have. You have to have the opposition and essentially keep the enemy knight in limbo. Here, the black knight can do whatever the heck it wants, such as the simple knight to d5, cutting off the white king. And this is a very, very easy win. Like king f5, knight e4, etc. There's no draw to speak of. So the correct move is knight takes d5. In this position, after takes d5, takes e4, we have the opposition. The black knight is stuck essentially in limbo. If black plays king to d6, white draws immediately. Don't fall asleep when play king to d4. I mentioned this in the previous video. In the opposition draw, you don't just blindly follow the enemy king. You follow it until you're able to make direct contact with the pawn. Here, king f5 is the drawing move, and then back to f4, forcing black to give up either the knight or the pawn. So the more resilient move for black is knight back to f6 check. Now we play king f4, and after king f7, we don't, strictly speaking, need to play king f5. King to g5 also draws, but the more classical way to draw is to play king f5 and to keep the opposition. This is by far the easiest. King to g5, king to g7. We are just shadowing black's king. Black's king has very limited range of motion. Piskov tried king e7. It was met by king e5. He tried the useless maneuver knight to g8. White simply plays king f5. If knight h6 check, obviously king to g5. And once again, black has to give up the pawn or give up the knight. And so black immediately acquiesced to the draw in this position. There's nothing to try. This is the beauty of the opposition draw. It's not like, it's not like it's some positional draw. Maybe This is just clear cut. If you understand the concept, it's really, really easy. I think it's a lovely, really, really beautiful endgame theme. Black is up a full knight. The pawn is protected, and yet, because of the power of the king and the particular placement of the knight, the stronger side cannot make any progress whatsoever. So, direct application of the opposition draw. And for a little bit of extra credit, black actually is winning in this position, but there's only one winning move. So, king e6, so natural. How can you resist the temptation? The winning move is actually king to f6. And the whole point is to avoid the opposition draw. If white does the same thing, it's black who seizes the opposition. Again, it's all about whose move it is. If it's black to move, it's a draw. If it's white to move, you have to slide away from opposition, allowing black to untangle and win the game easily. This is what everything comes down to in these endgames. It's these small moments, it's these subtleties, it's whose move it is, and that's why you have to be so incredibly attuned to all of the themes. But on top of that, to also try to calculate concretely when you can. Okay, so on we go to the next example. This one I really like. It's very pretty, but it's also a very common situation. It's a very common kind of archetype where in knight versus pawn endgames, where one side has a knight that's stopping a pawn on one side of the board, and then on the other side of the board, you have a certain arrangement of pawns. So this is kind of a typical illustration of that. In this position, which occurred in a game between two unknown Danish players, Mortensen versus Norman Hansen, Holger. This was played in Copenhagen in 1954. Again, I really like these old games. White plays the natural move, king to b4. White's goal is to eliminate the pawn and then to use the knight and ward off the bloodthirsty black king. Let's flip the board, which, have I been forgetting to do that? I have not. No, I think I have not been forgetting to flip the board, because so far we've essentially only solved for white, except for one example. In this one, we're solving for black. We are trying to draw the game. The draw is extremely narrow. It's really, really nice. And I will give you the hint and say that it is quite counterintuitive. So let's see if you can figure out the narrow drawing path that allows black to save the game. Okay. So in order to solve this position, the most important thing is to rule out the most natural move. Most people, including myself, probably in, let's say, a bullet game, would not be able to resist the temptation to play king. I mean, king e6, so natural, it seems like you're going to eliminate white's pawns. But that is an illusion. That is an illusion because after king takes a3, king f5, you have to understand the concept of the ideal formation. Now, the ideal formation in the typical sense is, let's say, knight on f3 and a pawn on g5, where approaching the knight will allow the pawn to move forward. But ideal formation should be thought of more generally as a situation in which a knight defends a pawn and the knight is in some sense unassailable. You have to be very, very careful about these types of formations as the defending side. Unfortunately, this line allows just such a formation. How does white achieve it? Well, white achieves it by understanding that you're not going to save the h-pawn, but you can save the g-pawn. You go knight to d5, king to g4 is forced, knight f6 check, and this is an instructive situation that everybody should pay very careful attention to. That look at this knight. It's completely unassailable. The pawn on g5 guards the h6 square. Black's king can do nothing but passively spectate as white's king kind of casually saunters over and ultimately wins the g6 pawn. So, unfortunately, king e6 loses to this line. So then you might say, well, maybe we can go a2. Maybe we can deflect the knight and then go king e6, but this is actually exactly the same thing. It doesn't really matter where white's king is. White just goes back to c3, and again, we've lost. So the correct approach is actually doing the opposite. We often think instinctively about using our king to eliminate these pawns, but you can also use your pawns to eliminate pawns. You can use the concept of trades in order to soften up the structure or to change the structure to your favor, another pawn endgame concept, and then the king can be used more successfully. What is all of this pointing to? It's pointing to the brilliant move h6, engineering the first trade. So white has a choice. White can ignore and play king takes a3. And here black draws very straightforwardly. We trade on g5, we play king e6, and white's knight is simply unable to get to h7. This is the bottom line. Knight e4, king f5, and white loses the pawn. King f5 is simply unstoppable. So for that reason, g takes h6 is the only sensible winning attempt. Now, our king actually takes the opposite route. And this is what I like about this example. We think it's king e6. No, the king actually goes the opposite direction. It goes back to g8. And the path that we're taking is, well, seemingly it's to take h6 and then to move to h5. White's not going to allow that to happen. So white has to take the pawn on a3, otherwise the knight is not going to move. We play king h7, and Mortensen says, wait a second, I'll give you the h-pawn, but I'm going to get to g3 in time. I'm not going to give you the other h-pawn. Okay? And it looks like white has achieved something resembling an ideal formation. Because if you push g5, you get the actual ideal formation, like the one I described in the previous video, where the knight sits behind the pawn. Why is this so problematic? Because black is confined to, the radius of this pawn. The moment you play king f4, white pushes h6. This is what you need to avoid. So with g5 not possible, how on earth are we going to get to this pawn? Well, it turns out that white's king is sufficiently far away that black can actually do the incredibly cumbersome end around. You could go back to g7, around to f6, around to f4. Now it's time for this, and there's nothing that white can do. White is a tempo short. In the game, white played knight e4, and the game was agreed drawn after king h6. I should point out that after knight f6, g5, h5, you get the non-ideal formation. And here, white has to take the pawn and give up the h-pawn. On g3, the knight is blockading the g-pawn, which is what makes that square so valuable. But what happens if white tries to bring the king over? Well, as you can see, and to those of you who calculated this line in its entirety, big congrats. This was a very difficult one. King d3, king f4. And just because of the arrangement of the knight and the pawn, white is unable simply to defend the h-pawn. It's just math. Knight f1, king to g4. That's it. We eliminate the pawn. We draw the game. So what does this example teach us? What are the themes, first of all? Well, first of all, we can see the importance of recognizing that in order to eliminate pawns, you can use your king, but you can also use your own pawns. Right? Trading is a very powerful weapon that people just sometimes forget about, especially when there's such a tempting option as king e6, king to f5. Brute force calculation, very important here. The lines in this sequence are essentially forced. There's not that much that white can do, so it's all about being able to visualize these long lines, thinking methodically, and not going for the autopilot move on the first move, which is super important. Okay, so I have one more example for you, and then one kind of frivolous example. We're just about in an hour, so I actually think this is a pretty decent length, and we'll see about that other position when we hit the end of the video. So this is a position between two elite players. Most of the games we've looked at today have been between strong players, not elite players. These are two elite players. Jolatier, now retired French Grandmaster, one of the strongest in the world in the 90s. Boris Gelfand really needs no introduction. This was played in an online event, actually, in 2020, where Jolatier made a return. I was watching this event, so I probably even watched this game. I don't remember. It was a long time ago. And in this position, presumably in acute time pressure, and these are older guys, they're probably in time pressure, they're probably playing on seconds. Latier makes by far the most natural move, b6 check. Okay. Now, you should take a second and try to understand who's playing for a win. That should be quite easy to determine. White's got a pawn on b6. And then you should take more than a second and see if you can figure out how Boris Gelfand was able to save the game with a, I would say, fairly straightforward, but nonetheless extremely instructive sequence of moves. Okay. Having taken the Eigenmatter-like customary sip of water, now the first decision is an easy one. You cannot allow the pawn to reach b7. If you allow the pawn to reach b7, the knight is going to run circles over the bishop. This is what the knight is really good at. It's good at winding its way into a particular square or set of squares. You cannot contain all of the knight's pathways to c6 or d7, which will drive the king out, which in turn will allow white to promote. Therefore, you have to sack the bishop. And you can do this without calculating any further. And the reason I gave these two examples in the sequence that I did is because this actually is almost exactly the same concept that we addressed in the previous example. It's a very different position. It's wearing different clothes, but it's exactly the same thing. Now, what am I talking about? Well, we have a situation where white's king is relatively far removed. Black's king is much closer to white's pawns, and your hand is just reaching to play king to d6. It's just so natural. And if we can get to e5, maybe we'll even play for a win. You can envision all these pawns falling. But wait a second. Remember that the knight has tremendous restrictive potential. And after knight to c4 check, our dreams, there are no more dreams because the king has to go the other way. And the knight is just much faster. It's much more agile than the king, and it's able to get to this h6 pawn a lot faster than black can do anything. For example, king to d4, knight takes f7, king takes e4, knight takes h6, and white is completely winning. You're just going to move the knight away and promote the h pawn. By the way, king e5, knight g8 is kind of a cool line. Again, the restrictive power of the knight should not be underestimated, and white promotes the h pawn. Okay, so once you refute king to d6, the task becomes a lot easier, especially if you've paid attention to the big takeaway of the previous example, which is that you can use your own pawns in order to adjust the pawn structure favorably and in order to make the task easier for the king. So the correct move is the pawn breakthrough f5. Maybe this move was more natural to you than king to d6. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. If you spotted this move, congrats. What does f5 do? Well, it does two things to be exact. After the trades, and white has nothing better to do than to take twice, we have the passed pawn on g5, which is a huge asset, and both of white's remaining pawns are isolated, so they're going to be much easier for the king to capture. Now, what is the order of operations here? The order of operations is to start with g4. You have to start with g4. If you start with king to d6, again, you allow the ideal formation. Knight c4 check, knight to e3, and the knight sits behind the pawn. Boom. Nothing that black can do here. Okay. So what do? We push g4. First, you have to notice that the f-pawn is not promoting. We can stop it with king to d6. So the point of g4 is to first fully restrict white's knight, and only then, once the coast has been cleared, to advance our king and to tackle white's two remaining pawns. White has to address the pawn. He does it with knight to c4. Black pushes to g3 as far as it'll go, restricting the knight, and only now we advance our king. King to d6. Latier tries to make a run for it, tries to assist the knight. This is often what happens. Tempo for tempo. Now, do not play king to e4 here. There's pitfalls everywhere. This transitions into a pawn endgame. And after f8, queen g1, queen, you have to be aware when the king and the queen are located diagonally at the end of a pawn race. We've encountered these examples aplenty, and white wins the queen. There's still very possible to blunder. Once again, the correct idea is to use your pawns. Use your pawns, g2, deflecting the knight. Knight takes g2, king takes f5. And black draws very cleanly because the pawn on h5 cannot be defended. But what I just said is not entirely, well, it's true. But what's amazing is that after king to d3, king to g5, the game was drawn in this position. But let's imagine that Gelfand, in his infinite generosity, and he's a very generous dude, gives white two moves in a row. Well, white would presumably accept very kindly and play king e4, knight f4. But as hopefully you now know and you understand this concept, this is a draw. This is the classic opposition draw, just of the kind that we did, king to g4. Boom. No questions asked. This actually might be almost exactly the position that we examined in the definitional video. Just one subtlety here, you have to claim the diagonal opposition in order to keep contact with the pawn. King f3, you have to be careful. You have to play king to h4. And if you play king to f5, then you allow the knight to reroute to a more convenient square and push the black king away. So when you're making this opposition draw, you have to be careful, you have to be vigilant, but ultimately it comes down to fairly simple pattern recognition. King g5, king f3, king h4. King e3, king g5. For king g4, king e5, king g5. So you hold the opposition most of the time with a couple of concrete exceptions, and not allow the knight essentially to reroute. Okay? Okay, so one more time. After b6 check, bishop b6, knight b6, we resist the temptation to play king d6. The drawing idea is simply to push f5, break through, use the g-pawn to tie down white's knight, and then finally use the g-pawn again, deflect white's knight, and the final pawn is the most vulnerable one. Now, the final kind of comical example that I wanted to show before we draw some conclusions and talk about kind of next steps is this crazy game that I discovered. This was just like an online blitz tournament. It was like a 1700 against an 1800. I wanted to find an example of like a cautionary tale where, you know, a player gets smug, they think that they're totally winning, and I wanted to also show that knowledge of these theoretical endgames actually is important. It will actually save you points. So this is a funny position in which black is completely winning. And you might look at this and say, black is completely winning, but I remember something about like the imprisoned king draw. Isn't this supposed to be a draw? It can be a draw when the black pawn is on h2. If the black pawn is on h3, it's completely winning. The easiest way for black to win is just to drop the knight back to e4. King f3, king g1, king f1. You could play anything, king h1, king g3, and just deliver checkmate or promote the queen. But black plays a move that also seems to win, king to h1. Logical, preparing h2, and yet this move gives away the win because it leads us directly into the imprisoned king draw. The imprisoned king draw, which is a theoretical drawing position. White suddenly plays king to g3, forcing black to play h2. Now white returns to f2, and to black's horror, he realized that this is the imprisoned king draw. With black to move, it is a draw. Whether this is a draw or a win depends on whose move it is. If it's white to move, obviously white is lost because white is in Zugzwang. But the whole point is that mathematically, the knight is unable to lose a tempo. It is unable on its own to reach the same position with the other side to move. You need auxiliary, you need assistance, you need a pawn move, you need something. You can't do it with just a knight. Black wandered around for a while before finally accepting his fate. So just a funny little example. I wanted to show this at the start, but figured I'd cover this one as well. Wow. Okay, so minus a couple of the portions that Clyde is probably going to edit out, where I was attending to business. This is going to be about an hour. I'm tempted to do that other game, but you know what? I think I'm going to dedicate a separate video to it. It doesn't cost money for me to make another video. I don't just want to like spit everything out in one video. I want you to have a chance to internalize everything, to process it. This final example is so epic that it definitely deserves its own videos. That might be in the next video. I might put it off until the practicum is complete and then do a separate video on it. But before I let you go, let's summarize. I hope you enjoyed the positions. Obviously, they varied in difficulty. Most of them were very, very tricky. And just like I said in the pawn endgame test, the point, this is not like a school test where you're aiming to get 10 out of 10. The point is to expose yourself to real life scenarios where these concepts are at play. Because if you just give the definitions and give a bunch of basic examples, that's not going to teach you how to play the endgame. You need to be able to intertwine these concepts and to tease them out of these very chaotic landscapes that actually tend to occur in real games. So really, really quickly, I forgot to change part 1 to part 2. I apologize for that. We started with the scenario in which we were trying to win with the pawns. We started with this lovely tactic in which white reached the Sheron position. Then we talked about how the king can unexpectedly come to dominate the knight and how it's important to not automatically push a pawn. Sometimes leading with your king is what does the trick. We talked about the relationship dimensionally between the king and the knight, how if you're trying to restrict the knight vertically or horizontally, you want there to be 2 squares between the king and the knight. Diagonally, you only want 1 square. Our next example featured this trouser-like situation in which we have to deflect black's king and then try to get our own king onto kind of the dream position, but black uses his pass pawn to create counterplay. And yet we use a theme from pawn race video, which is to force the enemy king onto an undesirable square in preparation for a pawn race. In this case, we do it via g7. And again, in this example in particular, you have to be ultra vigilant about the imprisoned king draw, where even though you win the knight in the corner, the enemy king is able to tail you into that corner and ultimately stalemate you on c7 or c8. So this pawn is a very desirable pawn to have, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Okay, finally, we talked about the power of restriction, this example in which white suddenly paralyzed the knight with g5, but then had to play ultra precisely, in particular, not hurrying with h3. I can talk forever about these concepts and definitions, but it goes without saying that calculation is at the forefront of everything that you do in the endgame. Naroditsky, I think, had a pretty famous phrase that basically an endgame expert is someone who can accurately calculate small variations. And that's surprisingly deep. When you look at these examples, it's not necessarily, like deep calculation that you have to do. It's, these 3 or 4 move lines, perception to detail. That's what's much more important, particularly in most pawn versus knight endgames. We didn't look at this example. Then we transition to part 2, which of course it still says part 1. Maybe now I can change it. A little bit too late. Drawing with pawns. You're the side of the pawns. You are trying to draw the game. We started with an opposition draw in which white is able to sack the knight and then get a situation in which black cannot make any progress despite being up a full piece. This is a pretty direct application of what I talked about in the previous video. We then talked about the very important concept of how to liquidate the opposing side's pawns, particularly in a situation where there's, let's say, one pawn on one side of the board, and then you are trying to get rid of the pawns on the other side of the board. The most important thing is not to automatically use your king. It's great if you can do that, but oftentimes using your king is the cumbersome method and enables your opponent to achieve some sort of an ideal construction, with the knight. Another takeaway here is that the knight is much more spry than you might think it is. It doesn't seem like it can cover big distances, but that can be very deceptive. And that's why you need to be very, very concrete in calculating lines like these. So the correct move here was h6, and off we went. Finally, we had this Latier-Gelfand example. By the way, if white had started with e5, white would have won the game easily because you would have simply prevented any shenanigans with the f-pawn moving. So a little bit of prophylaxis would have done the trick for Joël Latier. Instead, he gave this check. Gelfand sacrificed the bishop, and exactly the same thing. Do not rush to use your king. Instead, use the breakthrough, soften up your opponent's pawns, use your passed pawn, and give the knight everything that you've got. Whew. Okay, guys, I think on that note, hopefully this was a suitable summary. We have barely scratched the surface. This is, just a very small sampling of the many instructive positions that I could be giving you, many of which I didn't include in this video. My dream is ultimately to have a larger database of test positions, more videos, but I hope that this was a serviceable way for you to review the themes outlined in the introductory video. In the next video, we will do the exact same thing, but we will take the side of the knight. You will be playing with the knight, and it will be divided, much like this video, into the same 2 parts. You will be trying to win in a certain set of positions, and then you will be trying to make the draw. And hopefully in this way, we have done justice to both the pawns as well as the horsey, which we all love so dearly. Okay, I'll let you guys go on that note. I'm pretty happy with how this video came out. As usual, please leave feedback in the comments if you thought the positions were too hard, not interesting. If you think my explanation was lacking and you felt completely lost, please let me know that as well. I try to incorporate that feedback. I do read most of the comments, even if I don't always respond to them. So I really appreciate this community and how much it makes me better. I mean, you guys make me better. You bring out the best in me. And it's truly a team effort all the way. So happy endgame play. Go trade queens and crush some people. And most importantly, whether you have the knight or you have the pawns, you can do it. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.